I could not stand up straight. Not because I was sick, not because I was hurt in any way you could see. It was my first week as an Amish wife, and my legs were shaking so badly under my long dress that I had to grip the edge of the kitchen table just to keep from falling. And when I looked around the room at the other women, hoping someone would say something, hoping someone would ask if I was okay, nobody said a word. They just kept working. Because in that house, in that world, silence wasn't just expected. Silence was the rule. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why staying silent nearly broke me, and what finally made me speak. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found this story. And if you've been with me for a while, thank you for coming back to hear more of what my life was really like growing up Amish, and what happened after I left. This is one of the hardest stories I've ever had to tell, because it's not really about leaving the community. It's about what happened before I even thought about leaving. It's about the week I became a wife, and the week I learned that being a good Amish woman meant making yourself disappear. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you expected you to just accept something, and you weren't allowed to even ask why? Type yes in the comments if that's ever happened to you, because I think you're going to relate to this more than you expect. Let me take you back to the beginning of that week, because to understand why I couldn't stand, you need to understand what came before it. I was 19 years old when I got married. In our community, that wasn't early. Some girls married at 17. I had known my husband for less than a year, and knowing him meant a handful of supervised visits, a few letters passed through a sister, and one long buggy ride home from a Sunday singing where we barely spoke 10 sentences to each other. Our marriage wasn't arranged in the way people imagine, with parents picking partners like livestock, but it wasn't exactly a love story either. It was more like an agreement, a quiet nod from both families that this made sense. He needed a wife to run his household. I needed a husband, because that was simply what a 19-year-old Amish girl did next. There was no other path anyone had ever shown me. The wedding itself was beautiful, in its own plain way. Long tables of food prepared by dozens of women in the community. Hymns sung slowly in High German. A bishop reciting scripture about submission and duty. I wore a new dress, dark blue, with a white cape and apron pinned tightly across my chest. I remember my hands were ice cold the entire ceremony, and I remember thinking, this is the last day I will ever just be myself. After today, I am someone's wife, and I had no idea how literally true that was going to be. Because here's something people outside the community rarely understand. The wedding isn't really the beginning of a partnership. It's the beginning of a role, and that role comes with expectations that no one explains to you directly, because everyone assumes you already know them. You're supposed to absorb them simply by watching your mother, your aunts, your older sisters. You're supposed to know, instinctively, without being told, exactly how to become invisible in your own home. If you're finding this story interesting so far, make sure you hit subscribe, because I share stories like this every single week. Stories about what it's really like inside a world that most people only see from the outside looking in. The morning after the wedding, we moved into a small house on his family's property. It wasn't ours, not really. It belonged to the family, like most things did. And that very first morning, before the sun had even fully risen, I was expected to be up making breakfast. Not just for the two of us, for his parents, who lived just up the path, and often for his younger brothers, who worked the farm with him. I remember standing in that unfamiliar kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, in a house I didn't know yet, trying to find where the flour was kept, trying to figure out how the stove worked, trying not to cry from exhaustion and fear at the same time. My mother-in-law came in without knocking. She looked at the stove, looked at me, and said only one sentence, "You'll learn." That was it. No warmth, no guidance, no patience, Just an expectation that I would figure it out, and figure it out silently, without complaint, without questions, because complaining or questioning was seen as a sign of pride. And pride in our world was one of the worst things a person could have. By the end of that first day, I had cooked 3 meals for 8 people, washed dishes by hand in cold water, hung laundry, milked 2 cows I had never milked before, and stood through nearly 4 hours of visiting relatives who came to inspect the new household. Inspect is really the only word for it. They walked through our small home, touched the dishes, commented on how the beds were made, asked pointed questions about whether I knew how to can vegetables yet, whether I could sew a proper shirt, whether I understood how to manage a household budget. And through every single one of those comments, I was expected to smile, nod, and say nothing in my own defense. Here's a question for you. If you had to prove your worth to strangers within 24 hours of the biggest change of your life, how do you think that would affect you? Let me know in the comments, because I promise you, the answer changes everything about how this story unfolds. By the 3rd day, my body started to fail me. I want to be honest about this part because I think it's important. This wasn't dramatic collapsing, nothing like what you'd see in a movie. It was smaller and scarier than that. My hands trembled while I kneaded dough. My vision blurred slightly when I stood up too fast from kneeling at the garden. My lower back seized up from bending over a washboard for hours. And worst of all, by the end of each day, my legs simply would not hold me steady anymore. I would grip furniture, walls, door frames, anything solid, just to stay upright long enough to finish whatever task was in front of me. I remember one afternoon specifically, because it's the moment that changed everything for me. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew for the evening meal, and my legs buckled. Not dramatically. I didn't fall to the floor, but I stumbled sideways, hard enough to knock a chair over, hard enough that the sound brought my husband in from outside. He looked at me. He looked at the chair on the floor, and for one brief second, I thought finally, someone is going to ask if I'm okay. He picked up the chair, set it upright, and said, "Careful now." Then he sat down and waited for his stew. That was the moment I understood something I had never fully understood before, even though I had watched it happen to my own mother my entire childhood. In our world, a wife's exhaustion wasn't something to be addressed. It was something to be managed quietly, by the wife herself, without burdening anyone else with it. If you struggled where no one had to see it clearly enough to feel obligated to help. I want to pause here and ask you directly, because I think this question matters more than almost anything else in this story. Do you think staying silent about pain actually protects the people around us, or does it just protect the systems that are hurting us? I really want to know what you think, so please, drop your answer below, because I read every single comment on these videos. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of that unfamiliar bedroom, and I did something I hadn't done since I was a very small child. I cried without making a sound. I had learned somewhere along the way exactly how to cry silently. Shoulders still, breath even, tears just sliding sideways into the pillow. Because even grief had to be managed quietly in that house. Even grief could not be allowed to disturb anyone else's rest. The next morning, my mother-in-law noticed something. Not the exhaustion, not the trembling hands. She noticed that I had left one small stain on a shirt I'd washed the day before. She held it up in front of me at breakfast, in front of my husband, in front of his brothers, and said, "This isn't how we do things here." I apologized. I didn't explain that I had barely been able to stand while I was washing it. I didn't say a word about anything I was actually feeling. I simply said, "I'll do better," because that was the only acceptable response. If you're still watching, I want you to know something. This story does have a turning point. This isn't just going to be 40 minutes of suffering with nothing changing. But I need you to understand just how deep the silence went. Because without understanding that, you won't understand how hard it was to eventually break it. Let's talk about why the silence existed in the first place, because I think this is the part most outsiders never really grasp. It wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. My mother-in-law wasn't a monster. She had lived the exact same life I was now living. She had stood in that same kitchen decades earlier, trembling with exhaustion, and no one had asked if she was okay either. She had learned that suffering silently was simply what a good wife did, and she believed, genuinely believed, that she was helping me by not coddling me, by expecting me to be strong the way she had been forced to be strong. The entire system ran on this belief, passed down mother to daughter, generation to generation, that struggle was proof of character, and that speaking about struggle was proof of weakness or pride. Complaining meant you thought you deserved better than what God and the community had given you. And nothing was considered more dangerous to a young wife's soul than the sin of thinking she deserved more. Quick question for you before we continue. Have you ever realized that a harmful pattern in your life was being passed down from someone who genuinely believed they were helping you? That realization is one of the strangest, most disorienting feelings a person can have, and I promise you, it's coming up in this story very soon. By the end of that first week, something in me had shifted, even though I didn't fully understand it yet. I remember waking up on the 7th morning, and instead of feeling that familiar dread of facing another impossible day, I felt something closer to numbness. I had stopped expecting anyone to notice my exhaustion. I had stopped hoping for comfort. I had simply accepted that this was what being a wife meant. And that acceptance, looking back now, was the most dangerous moment of the entire week. Because when you stop expecting kindness, you stop noticing when kindness is missing. And that's exactly how silence becomes permanent. But something happened on that 7th day that I never expected, and it came from the last place I thought it would come from. My husband's youngest sister, a girl of maybe 15, had been sent to help me with the wash that morning. She wasn't married yet, still lived in her parents' house, still had that particular kind of freedom that comes before marriage locks a girl into a role. And as we worked side by side at the washboard, she suddenly said something so quietly I almost missed it. She said, "You don't have to be like her, you know. Like Mother, I mean." I didn't answer right away because I honestly didn't understand what she meant. She continued, still looking down at the wash, still keeping her voice low enough that no one else could hear. She wasn't always like this. She used to talk more before she got married. My aunt told me that once. That single sentence cracked something open in me that I hadn't even realized was sealed shut. Because if my mother-in-law had once been different, once had a voice, once had opinions and thoughts she shared out loud, that meant this silence wasn't simply who women were. It was something that had been done to her over years, the same way it was now being done to me. If this story is making you think about your own life in any way, I want you to comment the word voice below. Just that one word, so I know how many of you are sitting with this the same way I did that morning at the washboard. I want to be clear that nothing changed overnight. I didn't suddenly stand up and announce my independence at the dinner table that night. That's not how these things work. And honestly, that's not how change works in most of our lives, whether we grew up Amish or not. Real change happens in small, almost invisible moments. Moments that don't look like anything dramatic from the outside, but that quietly shift something inside you forever. The first small moment came about 2 weeks later. I was hanging laundry, and my legs, once again, started to give out beneath me from exhaustion. But this time, instead of gripping the clothesline and forcing myself to keep working in silence, I sat down. Right there in the grass, in the middle of hanging the wash, I simply sat down because my body would not let me stand any longer. And when my mother-in-law came around the corner and saw me sitting there, I did not immediately jump up and apologize. I looked at her, and I said, quietly but clearly, "I need a moment." 4 words, and I think you're about to see exactly why as this story continues. Over the following months, those small moments accumulated. I started saying, "I'm tired," instead of pretending I wasn't. I started asking my husband directly for help with certain tasks, instead of silently struggling and hoping he'd notice. Some days he helped, some days he didn't. But the asking itself, the simple act of using my voice instead of swallowing my needs, began to change something fundamental in how I saw myself. I remember one evening, maybe 8 months into the marriage, when my husband actually asked me something he had never asked before. He asked, "Are you happy here?" I didn't know how to answer at first because no one had ever asked me that question in my entire life. Not my parents, not my teachers, not the bishop. No one had ever framed my happiness as something worth checking on. I told him the truth, carefully, gently, because I still didn't fully trust that honesty was safe in that house. I said I was tired, more tired than I had ever imagined a person could be, and that sometimes I felt like I had disappeared inside the role I was supposed to be playing. He didn't have a perfect response. He wasn't equipped with the language for that kind of conversation any more than I was. But he listened. And for the first time since our wedding day, I felt like I was talking to a person instead of performing for an audience. If you've made it this far into the video, I want to genuinely thank you, because I know this isn't the kind of easy, dramatic story that some channels promise. This is slower, this is more honest, and I think that's exactly why it matters. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because there is so much more of this story to tell, including exactly what happened when I finally decided to leave the community years later. I want to talk now about the moment I truly understood why everyone had told me to stay silent, because understanding the why changed how I felt about the silence itself. Silence, in that world, wasn't really about controlling women specifically, even though that was absolutely one of its effects. Silence was about controlling everyone, maintaining a system that had worked in its own way for centuries, by ensuring that no individual voice ever grew loud enough to challenge the structure of the whole community. If wives complained, husbands might start questioning their own roles. If daughters questioned marriage, mothers might start questioning the choices they had made decades earlier. The entire system depended on everyone accepting their assigned role without too much examination, because examination is exactly what leads to change. And change was the one thing that community was built to resist above almost everything else. Understanding this didn't make the pain of that first week disappear, but it gave me something almost as important. It gave me clarity. I wasn't weak for struggling to stand during that first week. I wasn't prideful for wanting someone to ask if I was okay. I was simply a human being encountering an inhuman expectation. The expectation that a person could completely erase her own needs and call it virtue. Here's a question I want you to really sit with. How many expectations have you accepted in your own life simply because everyone around you treated them as normal, without ever actually asking if they were fair? Comment your honest answer below, because I think this question matters far beyond just Amish life. I think it matters to almost everyone watching this video right now. The years that followed that first week were not simple. I won't pretend my story became easy just because I started finding small ways to speak. There were still countless moments where silence was expected and where speaking came with real consequences. Sometimes disapproval from the community, sometimes tension in my marriage, sometimes exhausting arguments that left me wondering if speaking up was even worth the cost. But every single time I chose my voice over silence, even imperfectly, even nervously, I got a little bit closer to becoming a person instead of just a role. Eventually, that voice became loud enough to lead me somewhere I never expected during that trembling first week. It led me to question not just how I was treated within my marriage, but the entire structure of the world I had been raised inside. It led me, years later, to make the hardest decision of my life. The decision to leave the only community I had ever known, and to build a life where my voice wasn't something I had to fight for in stolen four-word sentences at a clothesline. That's a story for another video, and I promise you, it's just as raw and honest as this one. But I wanted you to understand where it all began. It began with legs that couldn't hold me up, a house full of people who noticed everything except my exhaustion, and a 15-year-old girl at It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this. And subscribe if you want to hear what happened when I finally chose to leave. Share this with anyone you think might need to hear that their exhaustion matters, that their voice matters, and that silence, no matter how deeply it's been taught. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, take care of yourself, and don't be afraid to use your voice, even if it starts as quietly as 4 small words at a clothesline.